It's nearly midnight. The harbor wind drifts like a lullaby threading through the windowsill. Outside, the lights of the city blink in drowsy rhythm, and the last ferry rolls like a cradle across the inky water. You're wrapped in something warm, maybe a blanket, maybe the weight of the week, and the silence hangs thick as copper. Except, there's a face watching you. She doesn't move, but somehow she hums. Her gaze is blank, but heavy like she knows something. Her crown pricks the sky, and her mouth, neither smile nor frown, feels too human for metal. That statue, you've seen it 100 times. But tonight, under this sleepy dark, it looks different, almost haunted, as if her face holds a story that no one told you. You may never know the end of this story, and that's okay, you'll be asleep by then. If you like this space and want to see me again on future nights, please like and follow. We have many more nights to tell stories together. Drop a comment with your location and local time. It's oddly comforting to know who else is drifting off with you tonight. Now, relax your body. Let your eyelids sag just slightly, and let's drift back, far, far back, to a room filled with sawdust and silence. You're standing in Paris. It's the early 1870s, but time is fuzzy here. You don't need dates, you just feel them. The windows are tall and streaked with ash from the stoves. The air smells like ink and burning wax. And in the center of the room, a massive copper face, unfinished eyes, closed like a goddess in mourning. Frederick Auguste Bartholdi is hunched beside her. His hair is frayed, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows, and his hands tremble slightly as he runs a finger down her cheek. You notice something. The mouth so delicate, the eyes weary kind, sad. She doesn't look like an abstract idea. She looks like someone he loved and lost. Bartholdi doesn't speak much anymore. Not since she died. Some say it was his mother, Charlotte, a force of pride and patriotism, who once told him France would need a great monument if it ever hoped to matter again. Others say it was someone softer. A woman with dark hair who painted in oils and hummed Italian songs in the morning. A woman whose name doesn't appear in any official history. What we do know is the first sketches of Liberty's face appear in his journal just weeks after the funeral. Coincidence, maybe. But those early drawings show something strange. Her eyes are closed. She isn't a symbol of victory or freedom, she's grieving. And here's the odd part. Those early designs weren't American at all. They were meant for Egypt. You step through another memory, the edges are frayed like cloth. Bartholdi was obsessed with the East. He dreamed of building a colossal statue at the mouth of the Suez Canal, a veiled woman in robes holding a torch. He called it Egypt bringing light to Asia. Subtle. Right. He even traveled to Cairo, where the sun cracked the stone, and the smell of cinnamon and camel dung stuck to his boots. The Egyptian project fell through, too expensive, too French, too imperial. But the statue, the idea of it, the face, stuck with him. When America came calling, Bartholdi barely adjusted the design. He gave her a new name, Liberty Enlightening the World, but her face stayed the same. Because perhaps he couldn't let go of whoever she was. And maybe you've never thought about this. Why that expression, the Statue of Liberty, doesn't smile. She doesn't inspire joy or triumph. She looks like someone who's seen war hunger, the inside of a courtroom, the end of something precious. That face isn't victorious. It's enduring. Rain begins to fall now softly, somewhere far in the background. It might be outside your own window, or it might be the soft patter of copper plates being forged decades ago. Either way, the sound helps you breathe slower. Back in Bartholdi's studio, one of his assistants is lighting a lamp. Shadows shift across the walls. On a table nearby lies a small framed portrait. He flips it face down before the visitors enter. Historians have begged to know who was in the photo. Some claim it was simply a placeholder, a study for form. Others whisper it was Bartholdi's secret fiancée, a woman he could never marry because of her status or religion or scandal. No records confirm her existence, and yet, the statue's face hints at something deeply personal. You hear a knock. The studio door creaks open. It's Edouard de la Boulaye, a man with a bushy mustache and big American dreams. He's come to remind Bartholdi that the Americans want progress. They want optimism. They want grandeur. But Bartholdi doesn't change the face. Instead, he builds around it. Here's where it gets curious. The body of the statue is powerful, yes, raised arm, straight back, fierce robes. But it's also generic. It's the face that slows you down. It's the face that doesn't quite fit. It's the face that whispers, "I remember something terrible." And in fact, she does. You don't know it yet, but the copper used to form her cheekbones came from a foundry that once made cannonballs for the Franco-Prussian War. Some of those cannonballs never fired. They were melted down, reformed into thin copper sheets, and hammered gently into Liberty's skin. So there's war inside her. There's grief inside her. You turn slightly. The harbor is still. The fog has begun to roll in soft, cool, and thick enough to blur the edges of the statue in the distance. Somewhere in the city, a bell tolls once. Maybe it's midnight. Or maybe it's the end of something else. And just then, a flash of lightning. Quick, silent. It reveals the outline of Liberty's face again, her eyes still holding that invisible ache. Then darkness. The kind that asks no questions. The kind that lets you rest.
The rain has stopped. Not entirely, just enough that you can hear its last reluctant taps on the roof, like fingers trailing off a drum. The air smells cleaner now, edged with the faint trace of soot and old paper. Somewhere a wooden floor creaks as someone shifts in their chair. That someone is you, settling in deeper, slipping further. Back in Paris, the workshop still waits. Dust has gathered around the bust of Liberty. She stares blankly through the gloom, unfinished, her mouth set in that same unreadable calm. But tonight, you step deeper inside. Past the copper moldings and the bundled sketches, you step into Bartholdi's private room, the one no apprentices entered without a whisper of permission. This was where he kept the memories. A cracked leather notebook sits open on the table pages, soft at the edges, from years of silent fingers. It's filled with obsessive cross-hatching, the eye drawn again and again, left, right, shadowed, tear-streaked. You notice something else. Every page bears a tiny L in the corner. For Liberty, no. It's too early for that. Maybe Louise, or Lucy, or perhaps just loss. Frederic Auguste Bartholdi was a man admired for his discipline, but known by the few close to him for a kind of possessive mourning. He carried grief like a blueprint. He folded it into his work until everything he made, from fountains to tombs, bore the fingerprints of someone long gone. And Liberty. She wasn't born out of hope. She was summoned from heartbreak. There's a painting on the wall, mostly covered by a gray cloth. You lift it in your imagination. Beneath, a young woman stares outward. Not noble, not regal, just kind. Her hair is pinned with small copper combs. Her eyes don't meet yours. She's looking at someone behind you, someone who isn't there anymore. Bartholdi never named her, but his letters mention her, always in lowercase, always followed by sentences he never finished. Now imagine him working by gaslight sleeves, rolled lips pressed together as if in prayer. His hands move quickly over plaster and clay. The assistants have gone home. It's midnight. The neighbors are asleep. But he keeps shaping her face over and over again, like if he gets it exactly right, she'll come back. People began to whisper. His former patron, the architect Viollet-le-Duc, once wrote in a note never published, he does not sculpt for France. He sculpts to resurrect. Strange words from a fellow builder of stone. But they weren't wrong. Remember that statue he tried to build in Egypt, the one for the Suez Canal? It failed officially because of cost. But unofficially, the Khedive reportedly found it too ghost-like. He said it didn't look forward, but backward. There's another odd detail. Bartholdi visited mental hospitals in the late 1860s. Just once, supposedly, but long enough to sketch several women from behind barred windows. When asked why, he said something about capturing the soul of confinement. But among the sketches from that visit, one matches Liberty's cheekbones almost exactly. Historians still debate whether Bartholdi was modeling Liberty after someone real or after an idea that had already started slipping from him. Here's where the obsession gets stranger. Once the statue's face was finalized, Bartholdi refused to let anyone alter it even when adjustments were needed for scale. The nose was too narrow for a structure 150 feet high, but he would not change it. Instead, the engineers adjusted the angle of the crown to balance it out. He said, "Her truth must remain," and no one questioned him again. You look closer at the face again. That down-turned mouth, those weary brows. It doesn't welcome, it watches. Some whispered that Bartholdi had begun speaking to the molds, that after long nights in the studio he would touch the clay and murmur things like, "You remember or you never wanted to go." A few apprentices quit. Others stayed and kept quiet. And when the full head was finally completed, towering and hollow like a cathedral dome, he climbed inside it alone. He stayed there for hours. It was pouring that day. They say he lit a single candle inside just behind the left eye. From the outside, it looked like the statue was winking or weeping. Here's a question. No one asks, why did he never sculpt another major female face again? In his later years, Bartholdi turned to abstract work. He made fountains, arches, muscular allegories of war and victory. Never again a woman, as if he had poured everything he had, every memory, regret, and longing, into one cold copper face. And it had taken something back from him in return. You pause now. A ship passes in the distance, a faint foghorn, low and distant, like a yawn across water. The city is quieter now, almost gone entirely. All you can hear is the tiny creak of time folding behind you. And in that strange silence, you think about all the statues you've ever passed. All the faces frozen in bronze and stone. How many of them stared not outward, but inward. Bartholdi's obsession wasn't just about building a monument. It was about preserving something he didn't want to admit had died. And in doing so, he made something too powerful to explain. Because the face of liberty doesn't just inspire, it haunts. You return to that room. You've been here before, Bartholdi's quiet chamber of statues and shadows, but now you step a little closer to the edge of things. The copper face still stares forward, but the light has shifted. It's deeper into the night. One of those impossible hours when time itself forgets how to move. You can almost hear the tick of an old Parisian wall clock, slow, hollow, like the sound of a breath you didn't take. And on the table, the photo frame, face down still guarded like a relic. The widow in the frame. She's not named in the official records. She doesn't appear in the design notes or the committee letters or the project documents held in dusty archives. But if you listen carefully to the stories whispered by dusty studio assistants and ignored newspaper margins, you start to see her shape appear. The debate, if you can call it that, begins with Bartholdi's own contradictions. In interviews, he claimed the face of the statue was purely symbolic, a synthesis of classical ideals, libertas Roman goddesses, the Greek concept of eleutheria, a cold combination of ancient virtue, he said. But then he added, once and only once, she is modeled after someone I knew. That sentence has plagued historians for over a century. Was it his mother, Charlotte Bartholdi? Certainly many believed so. Charlotte was his fiercest supporter, even as a widow raising her son amid the tension of post-revolutionary France. She was known for her strictness, her devotion to liberty, and her absolute command of the household. When Frederick was a boy, she posed for his first bust, and that resemblance never quite left his sculpting hand. The square jaw, the wide brow, the way her gaze demanded respect without asking. When the statue began, she was still alive, barely, but aging quickly. He sculpted in silence. She watched from her armchair, wrapped in wool, sipping licorice tea. It's not hard to imagine the quiet between them, filled with memory and unspoken love. And yet, that face isn't just maternal. There's something else, a sadness, a softness, not just dignity, but distance. Some researchers, particularly in the early 1900s, pointed to Bartholdi's cousin, Juliet. They were close, too close. Some whispered, she died young and there's no surviving image of her as an adult. But one letter survives, yellowed and torn, written by Bartholdi. To an unnamed recipient, I see her still not in the streets, not in the churches, but in the weight of empty chairs. She is not gone. She waits in every quiet room. Could she have been Juliet? Maybe. But others believe in someone even more mysterious. A woman named Jean Marguerite, last name erased in time, possibly a model, possibly a laundress, possibly something else altogether. One late account, published in an obscure Alsatian magazine in 1892, claims that Bartholdi fell in love with a woman during a secret trip to Montmartre, where painters and radicals spilled wine on cobblestones and wrote poems in charcoal. She died or disappeared before the project began. Some say she was pregnant. Some say she was buried in an unmarked grave near the outskirts of Paris, the kind reserved for those whose names weren't allowed in marble, the kind of woman no sculptor could acknowledge publicly, but couldn't forget privately either. Whatever the truth, the face of liberty stayed the same. And here's something else. The earliest clay model of her face, preserved now in the Musée d'Orsay, shows a much more human expression than what we see today. Her lips are parted slightly uncertainly. Her eyes are not yet carved into certainty. She looks like someone in the middle of remembering something painful. One art historian described it this way. She does not look triumphant. She looks like she's just lost something, and knows she must keep standing anyway. Isn't that what grief is? Not the collapse, but the standing. Back in New York, decades later, that very same face, 151 feet high, would become a symbol of welcome, freedom, courage. But the copper doesn't forget what it was molded for, or who molded it. And now, we get to the strangest part. There's a rumor always denied, never confirmed, that a second cast of Liberty's face exists. Smaller one, a private one, discovered in an attic in Sculptor Bartholdi's hometown by a man named Henri Kleiner in the 1930s. According to Kleiner's journal, which was never published, the cast bore subtle differences. From the public version, the eyelids were lower, the nose thinner, and most importantly, a small inscription hidden behind the left ear. Just one word: Perdu. Lost. That plaster face disappeared shortly after the Nazi occupation of France. Some say it was destroyed, others say it was taken. And now, back in the imagined room where you sit, whether it's a 19th century workshop or your dimly lit bedroom, the silence is thicker, the mystery deeper. Because whether it was his mother, his cousin, his lover, or a ghost known only to him, Bartholdi gave her to the world and never explained her again. And don't you feel it now that you know? That subtle ache behind her expression. The face of liberty meant to inspire nations might have started as a private tombstone. A secret grief cast in copper and raised so high that no one could look her in the eye long enough to ask, "Whose sorrow are you carrying?" You might be wondering, does it matter? Does the origin of the face change the meaning? Yes and no. Because myths evolve. Liberty came to represent what others needed her to be: hope, arrival, freedom. But under it all, under the oxidized green skin and lofty ideals, there's still that widow in the frame. Still waiting, still watching. You may be asleep before we finish her story. That's okay. She'll still be there holding the torch.
You wouldn't know it standing at the base of the Statue of Liberty today, but the enormous monument we now associate with freedom was once little more than a quiet gamble. Not just a logistical challenge, but a ghostly, fragmented construction, pieced together in silence behind factory doors. She was built not in grand spectacle, but in anxious whispers. You step now into Paris. Not the glittering Paris of candlelight balls and balcony serenades, but a gray, damp Paris in the early 1880s. The streets are narrow, the air smells of wet stone, coal smoke, and boiled cabbage. And on a corner of Rue de Chazelle, just past a creaking gate and an unassuming sign, stands the Gaget, Gauthier, and Carrera foundry. To passers-by, it's nothing but a warehouse. But inside, something enormous is growing. It is here that Lady Liberty begins to take shape in parts, giant parts, like a myth being reassembled from dream fragments: a shoulder, a nose, an elbow as long as a fishing boat. They rise under gaslight, surrounded by scaffolding that trembles with every gust of wind. The workers call her La Grande Dame, but always under their breath. She's not officially real yet. Bartholdi didn't want the statue to be real too early, because to many of his peers the idea was absurd. The French public had mixed feelings about gifting a colossal statue to the United States. France was still licking its wounds from the humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. The economy had dipped, revolutions had simmered, and Bartholdi, once hailed as a visionary, was now seen as a nostalgic sculptor chasing impossible ideas. So he went underground in every sense. Instead of trying to fund the entire statue at once, Bartholdi split it into segments both physically and politically. He convinced his backers to allow construction, part by part, first the hand, then the torch, then the head. This way he could drum up interest as he went, and hide the project if it failed. Torch-bearing arm was completed first and sent rather dramatically across the ocean to be displayed at the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. There it loomed over the fairgrounds like a strange copper relic detached from context. You walk through that World's Fair now, your shoes crunching on gravel, your coat too thin for the late spring wind. People point at the arm baffled. Children are allowed to climb up the staircase inside. The torch smells faintly of fresh paint and hot peanuts from a nearby vendor cart. Some found it inspiring, others ridiculous. Back in Paris, however, the rest of liberty was quietly being born. You slip now into the foundry's cavernous belly. It's darker than expected, the light cut by dust and smoke. The air trembles with the rhythmic pound of hammers. Long sheets of copper lie curled like fabric, waiting to be shaped by hand. One by one they're hammered onto wooden molds to form Liberty's outer skin, 300 distinct pieces in total, each one no thicker than 2 pennies, but when assembled together they'll stand taller than the rooftops of Montmartre. And then there's the skeleton. For this, Bartholdi turned to Gustave Eiffel. Not yet famous, but already brilliant. Eiffel envisioned a flexible iron framework that would allow the statue to sway with the wind, not resist it. A kind of internal exoskeleton engineered like the spine of a cathedral. As the design grew more complicated, Eiffel made adjustments, constantly changing load-bearing joints, lengthening crossbeams, rebalancing the crown. One miscalculation and the entire statue could collapse under its own weight. Eiffel once climbed inside the ribcage and stayed for 18 hours testing angles in silence. "Il faut qu'elle respire," he said once. She must breathe. Money, however, was less cooperative. The French government offered moral support, not financial. Most of the funds came from private citizens, many of them working class. School children donated centimes. One elderly widow famously mailed a silver brooch with a note, "For the copper woman may she endure longer than I." Yet despite the romantic gestures, the budget remained tight. Workers sometimes went unpaid for weeks. Supplies ran thin. Bartholdi sold miniature versions of the statue, some barely a hand high, to keep the lights on. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, America was failing to do its part. France was building the statue. America was supposed to build the pedestal, the base on which she'd stand. But years passed and nothing happened. Congress refused to fund it. Newspapers mocked the project. Some called it a French folly, others an oversized coat rack. And so Liberty remained trapped in Paris, complete in parts, waiting for a home. But Bartholdi didn't stop. In 1883, a rumor spread that the statue was being scrapped, that the head and arms would be melted down, that the project was abandoned. Panic surged briefly. Bartholdi issued a rare public statement, calm, clear, and defiant. She waits because she must. To stoke public interest, the completed head was placed on display in the heart of Paris. You wander among the crowd now, watching people climb a wooden staircase to peer through her hollow eyes. There's something eerie about it, this disembodied head open to the sky, watching the city that made her yet never asked for her. She feels forgotten. The turning point came from an unexpected place. Emma Lazarus, a Jewish-American poet and social activist, wrote a sonnet titled "The New Colossus." She wasn't famous. She didn't write it for money or fame, just for the cause. The poem wasn't immediately loved. It was printed on a pamphlet for a charity auction and forgotten for years, but its lines echoed in quiet places. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. That quiet echo grew. Soon school children in New York were sending pennies. A newspaper campaign led by Joseph Pulitzer offered to print the name of every single donor, no matter how small the amount. Pedestal was finally funded not by millionaires, but by butchers, bricklayers, chimney sweeps, and grandmothers. And so the crates began to move. July 1884. The final rivet is hammered into place in Paris. The statue is disassembled, packed into 214 wooden crates, and prepared for shipment. Each piece is numbered not with names, but code. H1C3K9, a puzzle waiting for assembly. Before she leaves, Bartholdi climbs to the top of her torch one last time. He watches the sunset over his city fingers, resting on a copper flame he may never touch again. He doesn't speak, but you feel the silence. She's no longer just metal. She's history, memory, longing, and perhaps a kind of grave marker for someone the sculptor loved too much to forget. When the ship sets sail, the statue lies hidden in its belly, invisible to the world, as if sleeping, as if waiting to open her eyes again. And you standing now in the quiet corners of that foundry hear only the faintest trace of her name, Liberty, but only whispered furniture. You watch from the docks now. The air is hot thick with coal smoke and the briny scent of summer tides. The crates are massive, splintered, and labeled in a language most dock workers don't bother to translate. One man throws down his rope and mutters, "All this fuss for a statue." Another worker laughs, "Does it even do anything?" Welcome to Liberty's first moments in America. Immediately the chaos begins. Customs agents can't decide whether the statue qualifies as a gift or art. One even jokes about taxing it. The paperwork takes hours. Meanwhile, the crates sit in the sun, warping slightly. Wet drips. A reporter notes dryly that France has sent us a mystery, and we are already too hot to solve it. The problem wasn't just the weather, or the bureaucracy. It was the pedestal, or lack thereof. You walk now across Bedloe's Island, just off the southern tip of Manhattan. The soil is dusty, the grass yellowed, the wind stiff. At its center stands a half-finished pedestal, little more than stone ribs and scaffolding. The platform where the statue is supposed to go isn't ready, not even close. So Liberty waits. For months, she lies in pieces across the island, her feet in one crate, her head in another. Her crown sits awkwardly in a shed tilted like a misplaced chandelier. Islanders refer to the storage site as the graveyard. Children sneak onto the island just to touch a toe and say they touched a myth. The press, of course, has a field day. One paper declares France sends Puzzle America forgets instructions. Another prints a cartoon of the statue's head on a dinner plate with the caption "Bon Appetit," and letters flood into City Hall. Some demand the statue be painted, adorned, or hidden. One suggests using her arm to hold laundry. Another proposes putting a cigar in her mouth to reflect our true habits. What began as curiosity curdles into ridicule. Even some politicians join in. Senator William M. Evarts, who had once supported the project, now complains that the statue offends the skyline. A local reverend calls it paganism, cast in bronze. And Manhattan society ladies, never ones to ignore a trend, organize an anti-statue luncheon with the theme, "What else could we have done with that money?" The criticism doesn't stop at wit. There are serious concerns too. Maritime officials complain that the torch could blind sailors if lit too brightly. Engineers warn that the wind in New York Harbor is more violent than predicted. The statue could fall, they say, or worse, sway unnaturally. A few even suggest building it smaller. Bartholdi, now in New York for the final stages, is quiet. He walks the island at dawn coat, billowing, making notes in a leather-bound journal. One entry reads, "She stands still in pieces, and yet I feel her watching. And amid all this noise, there is one louder silence. The pedestal still needs money." Despite earlier campaigns, the final construction is short by thousands. City leaders refuse to fund the remainder. The federal government shrugs. Rich philanthropists sip brandy and declare it not our problem. So Joseph Pulitzer steps in. Yes, that Pulitzer. The newspaper Barron. He launches a campaign in the world, promising to print the name of every single donor, no matter how small. He shames the rich, he praises the poor, he stirs up something stubborn. And it works. School children send dimes. A street cleaner mails 27 cents in an envelope marked "for her." One orphanage sends a crumpled note with 46 nickels signed from the kids who want to see her. It's a turning point. But the love is still slow to come. When assembly begins in 1886, liberty doesn't spring up overnight. It's a painstaking, awkward ballet. Eiffel's iron skeleton is built first, a towering exposed lattice that looks like an unfinished church organ. Then come the copper sheets riveted with tiny echoing hammers that ring across the water like clock chimes. At one point, a rivet pops loose and injures a worker. Another falls ill after spending too long inside the statue's hollow leg. The rumors begin again. She's cursed. She doesn't want to be built. Even one foreman admits he's never felt so watched by a thing with no eyes. The public watches from afar, unimpressed. Ferries pass by slowly. One woman in a blue bonnet shouts, "Is that it?" Another mumbles, "She's so green." Yes, green. What we now recognize as her iconic patina was at first a disappointment. People expected gleaming bronze, proud and gold. What they got was a dull, weather-streaked figure that looked more like an oxidized coin than a beacon of glory. The final straw comes on Dedication Day, October 28, 1886. President Grover Cleveland arrives. There are speeches, flags wave, bands play, and then the fog rolls in. You're on the ferry now. You can barely see your own hands. The statue looms through mist like a ghost ship. The cannon salutes go off late. One speaker loses his place. A few spectators faint, and someone lights a firework too close to Liberty's base. It sizzles, soars, and explodes against her copper robe, scorching the lower folds. For a moment it looks like Liberty might burn. Guards rush forward. A coat is thrown. A flag is used as a blanket. The fire dies, but the moment lingers. The statue's first real public moment ends in panic. Sabotage, maybe. Just clumsiness, possibly. But it cements the idea in some minds that the statue is an omen, not a promise. Bartholdi is said to have watched from the shadows. He doesn't speak during the ceremony, doesn't smile. When asked what he thinks, he reportedly replies, "She is no longer mine. She belongs to those who watch." Still, over time, the jeers fade. The green becomes iconic. The torch becomes a fixture. And slowly, quietly, liberty finds her footing. She's embraced not for her perfection, but for her perseverance. But in those early months, don't let the brochures fool you. New York hated her first.
You'd think after years of planning fundraising, arguing, hammering, and hauling copper across the ocean, Liberty's grand debut would be smooth like a wedding, planned down to the last petal. But this was no fairy tale. It was the end of October, 1886. The harbor was dressed in fog. Not the gentle, dreamy kind, but thick, wet, and stubborn, the kind that clings to your hat and fogs your spectacles. The sky hung low and colorless. Rain was promised, but hadn't yet fallen. It felt more like a funeral than a birth. Boats crowded the bay, rocking uneasily. You're aboard one of them now, shoulder to shoulder with politicians, journalists, war veterans, and invited guests from every end of the social ladder. The engines groan. Someone lights a cigar. You tug your collar. It's warm, but it smells like tension. On Bedloe's Island, Liberty stands tall, fully assembled for the first time. Her greenish glow is still new. Her crown glints faintly through the mist, and there just below her outstretched arm, a platform has been rigged for the ceremony. President Grover Cleveland arrives pink-cheeked and awkward, squeezing into the crowd like a man late for his own dinner. There's a brass band playing something that tries to be both French and American, but ends up sounding like a polite argument. Speeches begin. One by one, the dignitaries drone on about democracy, friendship, and progress. The fog refuses to budge, and then it's time. With a flourish, the covering is dropped from Liberty's face, even though, frankly, she's already been visible for days. The crowd cheers, but only briefly, because her expression isn't quite what they expected. She isn't smiling. She isn't radiant. She looks tired. Regal, yes. Proud, maybe. But more like someone who's endured than someone eager to celebrate. Still, the crowd applauds until the fireworks begin. Now, fireworks were meant to be the grand finale, a display of glory in the new American century. Cannons were prepped, shells arranged, fuses tested. But somewhere between the weather and the timing, something went wrong. One shell veered too low, exploding near Liberty's base. A plume of sparks sprayed up her robe, licking the copper just above her sandals. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Another explosion followed closer, this time. A shower of hot embers drifted toward her torch. On the island, chaos erupted. One sailor dropped his hat and ran for water. Another grabbed a fire extinguisher, though it had barely enough pressure to douse a teacup. A local guard threw his coat over a small blaze, starting near the hem of her robe. Smoke curled up from her base. A hush fell over the boats. You stare at her now, heart thudding. For one frozen moment, it looks like Liberty might burn just hours after her unveiling. Her new copper gleams in the firelight. Her flame, meant to represent hope, suddenly resembles danger. It's controlled quickly, but the moment lingers. Bartholdi, watching from the shadows near the steps, says nothing. He doesn't rush in, doesn't protest. He simply watches the smoke coil into the air like a bad omen. The next morning, the newspapers explode with snark. Lady Liberty scorched on First Day Liberty's torch more than just symbolic goddess of fire indeed. No major damage was done. A few rivets were scorched. A small copper panel blackened near the base. But the symbolism that wasn't so easily wiped away. For critics, it was proof the statue had been cursed from the beginning. And the torch. That was a whole other problem. See, Bartholdi had designed Liberty's torch to be both decorative and functional. The original idea was that it would glow not just as an idea, but literally. Glass panes were fitted into the flame, and gas lamps were installed inside to light it from within. The result, blinding. On sunny days, the reflection from the gilded flame was enough to dazzle nearby boats. On foggy days, the torch glowed like a ghost, eerie and inconsistent. But at night it was worse. The gaslight flickered and danced across the glass, casting strange moving shadows. Some claimed they saw her torch pulse like a living thing. One passenger on a late ferry swore it blinked, and then the birds started crashing into it. Gulls, pigeons, once a hawk. Caretakers had to clean feathers and broken wings from the torch's platform nearly every morning. It wasn't just tragic, it smelled. The interior chamber began to reek of kerosene bird droppings and melted wax. A maintenance worker wrote in his notebook, "It's not a flame, it's a trap." To make matters worse, the internal heat from the gas lamps made the torch nearly unbearable to enter. Climbing up was like crawling into a kettle. Tools would get too hot to touch. One man fainted halfway up and had to be pulled down by his boots. Still, the torch remained open to the public briefly. People climbed up for the thrill, peered out over the harbor, and sweated through their Sunday clothes. But it didn't last. After several minor injuries and a particularly embarrassing moment when a dignitary cracked his head on a support beam, the torch was quietly closed to visitors. It's never been reopened. To this day, no one, not even VIPs, is allowed inside the torch. And then there's the mystery. You see, inside the original torch chamber, there was a small hatch. A metal door square and rusted even in the early days, bolted shut with no explanation, no keyhole, no markings, just there. Some said it led to a maintenance shaft. Others claimed it was a forgotten time capsule compartment. One engineer swore it was a Freemason seal. In 1902, a group of curious inspectors tried to pry it open. They couldn't. The bolts had fused with age. When asked about it, Bartholdi, still alive at the time, offered no explanation. Just a shrug. "The light must always be above us," he said cryptically. During World War I, Lady Liberty's torch suffered again. On July 30th, 1916, German saboteurs attacked the munitions depot on Black Tom Island, just across the harbor. The explosion was massive. It shattered windows in Manhattan, knocked clocks off walls in Times Square, and sent tremors through the statue's iron skeleton. Her arm shook. The torch cracked. Glass panes splintered. Metal warped. A small piece of the flame dislodged and fell, missing the island's edge by inches. The torch was permanently closed after that. Engineers declared it unsafe, too damaged, too risky. A replacement was planned, but for decades, nothing was done. The original torch stood there, cracked, burnt, and dark for almost 70 years. In 1984, during the statue's centennial restoration, it was finally removed and replaced with a sturdier replica, less glass, more copper. The original now rests in a museum beneath her feet. Tourists take selfies with it. Few realize it nearly killed birds, or people, or Liberty's debut. And so it is that Liberty's most iconic feature, her glowing torch, is also her most misunderstood. It nearly set her robe on fire. It blinded the innocent. It boiled its own visitors. And it stands, sealed unreachable high above the harbor, holding secrets no one has quite explained. Still she holds it. Because maybe that's the point. Even when you're misunderstood, even when your first night goes up in smoke, you stay lit. You stand tall. You try again tomorrow.
From a distance, she glows. Not the polished gold of royal crowns or the silver sheen of new monuments, but something gentler. A seafoam green. A blue-green blush that seems strangely eternal. But come closer. Closer still. And you'll see it, the cracks, the streaks, the scars beneath the skin. You step aboard the early ferry just after dawn. The wind stings a little, not harsh, but sharp enough to keep you awake. Around you, a quiet group of early tourists huddle in jackets. Cameras, coffee, quiet awe. As Liberty comes into view, someone gasps. Not loudly, just a soft intake of breath, like they forgot how tall she really was. She rises from the water, not as a beacon, but a figure who's been standing too long. Strong, yes, but strained, like she's holding something invisible. And she is. Her skin, that iconic copper exterior, is less than 3 millimeters thick. That's thinner than 2 pennies stacked together. Her skin is not her strength. It's her memory. Her strength lies within. Or it used to. The problems began almost immediately after she was assembled. Copper and iron don't like each other. Not when moisture is involved. And on Bedloe's Island, surrounded by salt water, battered by storms, kissed constantly by sea air, moisture is always involved. The interior skeleton designed by Eiffel was made of puddled iron. Strong, brilliant, and unfortunately reactive. Where the copper touched the iron, galvanic corrosion occurred. Electricity, tiny and constant, began eating away at the iron invisibly, like a whisper working away at a wall. By the 1910s, rivets had begun to rust. Beams showed swelling near joints. A soft, chalky residue was found in hidden corners, the signature of copper salts dissolving, and no one really did anything. Because she still looked fine on the outside. You're inside her now, climbing the narrow spiral staircase. It turns tightly, squeaks softly with each step. Above, daylight filters through the crown's 7 rays. Below, echoes drift upward, a tour guide's muffled speech. The scrape of a boot, a child whispering that it smells like old pennies. You pause near a porthole in her chest. The inner beams are exposed iron, once jet black, now streaked with reddish veins. Some bolts have fused into lumps of rust. On one section, a crack runs across a support plate like a wrinkle on skin. In the 1930s, there were quiet inspections. Engineers expressed concern. Minor metal fatigue, damp pockets in the base, loosened rivets near the torch. One suggested replacing the internal stairs. Another advised isolating the copper and iron with leather or zinc. But budgets were thin, and no one wanted to raise alarm. So the notes were filed. The rust spread. By the 1950s, Lady Liberty had become routine. She appeared on stamps, on coins, in movies. She was there, always there. The background of the American imagination. Solid, predictable. But inside, she was rotting. A 1976 report quietly stated that the iron framework in the right shoulder had buckled slightly. Tourists had been reporting an odd tilt when they reached the crown, a gentle sway barely noticeable, like being on a ship. Inspectors confirmed it. Her spine, Eiffel's once glorious central column, was bowing. Then, in 1980, a painter found a crack in one of the load-bearing beams. It was dismissed at first, then another crack, then another. Then the realization her torch arm, that proud outstretched symbol, had never been properly anchored. The rivets didn't align with the internal frame. The weight was being distributed unevenly. One strong wind, one lightning strike, and the arm could tear away. So they shut her down. The crown, the torch, the pedestal museum closed. For many Americans, it was shocking. How could she be broken? How could something so massive be so fragile? The restoration began in 1984, her centennial. A scaffold like a ribcage of metal and wood surrounded her entirely. She was swaddled in netting. Engineers crawled across her shoulders like ants, taking measurements, scraping corrosion scanning for weaknesses. It was delicate. They couldn't just replace parts. They had to preserve the skin, the original copper. But the skeleton beneath that needed replacing. Entire iron beams were removed and replaced with stainless steel. Modern materials treated with insulation to prevent further corrosion. Her crown had to be lifted with surgical precision. Her right arm braced with cranes. Her original torch, warped, damaged, and dangerously unstable, was removed and replaced with a replica more faithful to the original design. The old one was placed in a museum beneath her pedestal. Inside, the work was meticulous. Every bolt catalogued, every seam measured. They found names scratched into beams workers from the 1880s, leaving their mark. One simply wrote Henri, 1885. Rain. Another carved a heart. By 1986, she was rebuilt, reinforced, renewed. But she still bore her age. They didn't scrub away the patina. They left her green. Because that green isn't paint. It's scars. It's oxidation, the chemical memory of 100 years. To clean it would be to erase her. And what's a monument without its story? You step outside again now, back into the sunlight. She towers above you, serene. Tourists laugh. A child points. A breeze brushes her robe. She still stands. But not because she's invincible, because people took care of her. Because a country-floored, noisy hopeful decided she was worth saving. And that may be the most American thing of all. You know his name, Eiffel. You might even picture the tower. That long iron needle slicing into the Paris sky. But what you might not realize is this: before Eiffel built the tower that bears his name, before the postcards, before the spotlights, he built a skeleton. One that lives inside Lady Liberty. And for that, he was almost entirely forgotten. You're walking through his workshop now. It's not glamorous, not filled with marbled busts or romantic sketches like Bartholdi's. No. Eiffel's space smells of grease and graphite. Tables are stacked with calculations, rulers, iron rods, and pages full of numbers that lean on the edge of madness. He wasn't building art. He was building endurance. When Bartholdi approached him in the late 1870s, the Statue of Liberty was still an awkward dream, mostly torso and ideology. The idea was grand, the design daring, but no one could figure out how to hold her up. The statue was too big for traditional masonry. Her copper skin, though beautiful, was thin, far too thin to support itself. Her right arm stretched 40 feet into the sky. Her crown and torch were heavy offset and vulnerable to coastal winds. If not engineered with surgical precision, she'd sway like a sapling. Or worse, fall. Enter Eiffel. He proposed something radical. Rather than building liberty like a Greek statue, solid and self-contained, he would construct an inner spine, a central pylon of wrought iron that would bear all the weight. Around that spine, he'd create a lattice of support beams and secondary struts that connected to the copper shell via flexible metal brackets. This meant liberty would move. Slightly, yes, but intentionally. Her arm would bend with the wind. Her robes would flex in the heat. She would be alive, structurally speaking. At the time, this was revolutionary. No one had ever engineered a statue at this scale. Eiffel's system allowed for thermal expansion, shifting loads, and the gale force winds of New York Harbor. It was a masterpiece of industrial-age engineering, the bones of a goddess built like a suspension bridge. And yet, most people didn't even know he was involved. His name was buried in a few engineering documents, not on the plaques, not in the speeches. Even the newspapers credited Bartholdi and team. The only place you'll find Eiffel's full contribution acknowledged in her original form is deep inside the statue on a small plaque hidden within her iron ribcage. You climb there now. It's not glamorous. Narrow stairs, greasy handrails, flickering yellow light, a rusted bolt. Then a metal plate no larger than a book with his name etched, simply G. Eiffel Ingenieur. That's it. No fanfare. And Eiffel. He didn't complain. He moved on. Within a few years, he was already working on something taller, the 1,000-foot iron tower that would change his legacy forever. But what many don't realize is that the innovations of the Eiffel Tower were born in part inside Liberty. Her structure was his prototype, her strength, his blueprint. And still, she gets all the credit. It wasn't that Eiffel was unknown. In France, he was respected, but he was seen as a technician, not a visionary. And America loved stories. It loved Bartholdi's grief, his mother, his arm that traveled the country. No one wanted to hear about brackets, wind sway, or differential stress calculations. But Liberty would not stand today without him. In fact, we know that by the early 1980s, Eiffel's original iron frame had lasted almost a full century with minimal intervention. The corrosion began only because the protective barriers between copper and iron had failed, not because of his design. Engineers examining his framework during the restoration called it elegant, minimal, and astonishingly modern. One remarked he solved 21st century problems before the 20th had even begun. And here's something poetic. After the Statue of Liberty was completed, Eiffel reportedly visited her once, quietly, no press, no announcement, just a man in a coat boarding a ferry to see something he'd held up from the inside. He stood beneath her for nearly an hour, didn't climb, didn't speak, just looked up. Maybe he didn't need thanks. Maybe he knew something the world didn't, that some structures endure not because they are loved, but because they are held. Held by quiet hands, by forgotten beams, by minds that built strength, not stories. And so next time you see her, remember this. Behind every statue is a scaffold. Behind every icon, an engineer. The torch is beautiful. That's what they all say first. You've seen it in photographs, postcards reflected in 1,000 pairs of watery eyes on arriving ships. The torch held high above Liberty's head is a beacon, proud, solemn, aglow with symbolism. But what most people don't know is this. It used to be lethal. You begin tonight not at Liberty's base, but from above, gliding gently like a gull over the water. It's a quiet dusk. The harbor ripples softly. The wind carries salt and the occasional distant horn. And there she is, as always, standing steady, holding up the light. But her original torch, the one that Bartholdi designed, and that burned above the harbor for nearly a century, was never quite right. The idea was grand. The torch wouldn't just be symbolic, it would be functional. It would shine. It would guide ships. It would literally enlighten the world, just as her French name promised. So Bartholdi added glass, panels of it, hundreds of cut glass panes set into the copper flame designed to reflect the light from gas lanterns mounted inside. At night, it would gleam like a star. By day, it would glint like gold. What could possibly go wrong? Well, everything. Almost immediately, sailors began to complain. The reflections were too sharp, too blinding. On clear mornings, the sun would catch the flame and throw dazzling flashes across the water. Captains said it was like being stabbed in the eyes. One wrote in his logbook, "I mistook her for a flare." Fishermen called her the eye of the storm. And worse, the birds came. Migratory birds. They didn't know what to make of it. They saw the light and aimed for it. At night, flocks would sweep toward the torch, hypnotized by the glow. Some would circle for hours. Others flew straight into the glass. The crashes were soft at first, a thump, a feather, a quiet fall. Then it became a pattern. Caretakers began to find the bodies. Every morning, a handful at first, then dozens. During migration season, scores of gulls, sparrows, swallows, even the occasional falcon would lie broken on the torch balcony. A silent mourning ground just beneath the world's most famous flame. And the torch was hot. Too hot. The gas lamps created intense heat within the chamber. Temperatures sometimes reached 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The air shimmered, the metal groaned, and inside, maintenance workers sweltered. They joked that Liberty had a sunburned finger. One fainted during a routine inspection. Another, while cleaning the inner glass, reported dizziness and blurred vision. Like being inside a mirror box, he later said. In 1916, after the Black Tom explosion, the sabotage event that sent shrapnel ripping through Liberty's body, the torch took a beating. Cracks appeared in the glass. One support beam warped. The flame no longer closed properly. The torch was never the same. It was closed to the public. For decades, no one climbed into it again. The lights were dimmed. The doors bolted. Liberty's gesture remained. But the light inside faded. Still the glass panes caught the sun. Still the birds crashed. In the 1950s, an ornithologist named William Harvey began to investigate. He visited the site weekly cataloging species, drawing sketches, counting the casualties. His notes are heartbreaking. 23 birds this morning, mostly warblers. Some likely flew from Canada. Another entry reads, 1 redstart. Still warm. He tried to raise awareness, but few listened. Liberty was a symbol. You couldn't accuse a symbol of homicide, so Harvey kept collecting. By the 1970s, environmental activists began joining him. They demanded changes, the removal of reflective panels, softer internal lights, a shield around the flame. But nothing happened. The torch was historic. It couldn't be changed. Until 1984, the centennial restoration. Engineers reviewing the damage found the torch too unstable. The internal support frame was cracked in 3 places. The glass no longer sealed. One pane had fallen during a windstorm and nearly injured a passing visitor below. The decision was made the original torch would be retired. A replica was designed truer to Bartholdi's original vision before the glass was added. Solid copper, gilded in 24-karat gold leaf. Non-reflective, safer. Still brilliant in the sun, but no longer a mirror in the sky. The new torch was hoisted in place in 1986. The original lowered gently, placed inside the pedestal museum. And there it sits, charred, cracked, quietly humming with memories. You stand before it now. It doesn't look menacing. In fact, it seems sad, like a relic trying to remember what it once was. A small plaque beside it doesn't mention the birds. It doesn't mention the workers who fainted, or the sailor who briefly went blind, or the falcon whose wings snapped against a pane of glass. It simply says, Original Torch, 1886-1984. But you know now. You know it tried. You know it failed. You know it still glowed. And isn't that something? Even the parts of Liberty that didn't work still mattered. Even her mistakes, her bright, breaking, blistering torch lit the way for something better. It's not the climb that surprises you, it's the quiet. As you spiral your way up through Liberty's innards, the sounds of the world begin to fade. The water, the ferries, the tour groups, even the wind. It all slips behind copper ribs and stairwells. Your feet thud softly on the narrow treads. You reach for the handrails, still slightly cool, still smelling faintly of rust, old paint, and perhaps something stranger, like forgotten breath. The interior of the Statue of Liberty feels less like a monument and more like a body. The beams are bones. The metal skin curves above you like a ribcage. It groans occasionally, not from stress, but from memory. The air is warm, recycled, tinged with the scent of maintenance grease and worn denim. You hear another visitor's cough below you, distant as a seabird. And then, after 354 steps, some narrow, some uneven, you reach the top. You are inside her head. The crown from the outside looks regal, triumphant. But in here, it's small. You have to hunch slightly to fit. The ceiling presses low. The 7 rays that burst outward like a halo are solid beams. The 25 windows ring around you like portholes in a submarine. You press your face against the glass. The view isn't majestic. It's distorted, fog-streaked. The river below looks like tin foil. The skyline is slashed by glare. You don't feel above the city. You feel suspended, neither here nor there, as though Liberty herself hasn't decided if she's looking forward or back. And that's when you notice the ladder. It's narrow, rust-streaked, and bolted firmly to the wall. It once led higher into Liberty's torch, the room above, the place no one can go anymore, the torch chamber. Once open to the public, the torch was sealed after the Black Tom explosion in 1916. Officially, it was for safety. Unofficially, well, no one quite agrees. The damage was repairable. But something about the torch was different. Something closed and locked. You stare at the ceiling above you. There's a trapdoor just faintly visible, its hinges sealed tight with aged bolts. No signage, no handle, no invitation. But the stories still come. Some say there's a sealed compartment beneath the floor of the torch, a bronze capsule placed there by Bartholdi himself. Not a time capsule in the modern sense, but something stranger, more personal. One story, the kind only whispered by old caretakers and stubborn historians, claims Bartholdi climbed into the torch alone one rainy morning before the statue was fully unveiled. He brought with him a small wooden box sealed with twine. Inside, they say, was a lock of hair. Not his mother's, not his muse's, hers. Whoever she really was. The story continues that he wept while placing the box beneath the metal grate, whispering something in Alsatian that no one recorded. Then he climbed back down, said nothing to anyone, and had the hatch sealed the following week. Is it true? Historians argue endlessly. Some say no such compartment exists. Others say the floor was reinforced in the 1930s, and the original plates covered over. One inspection crew in the 1970s claimed to find an odd indentation, a square panel beneath a layer of riveted copper, but they were told not to investigate further. Respect tradition, the memo read. And then there are the symbols. In 2004, a team restoring the interior found etchings near the base of the torch ladder, strange looping characters that did not match any engineer's markings. Some resembled stars, others compass points. One looked disturbingly like an eye, a Freemason's sign. Maybe. Bartholdi was rumored to have Masonic ties, though nothing ever confirmed. Still, the statue's dimensions have long invited speculation. 305 feet tall, 7 rays on the crown, 25 windows, everything too perfect, too symbolic to be coincidence. But no one climbs to check anymore. The torch is closed to visitors, locked since 1916. You can peer at it from below. You can see it from helicopters. You can even visit the original, the one replaced in 1984, now resting quietly in the museum beneath her pedestal. But you can't go in. Not even engineers are allowed unless there's urgent maintenance. And when they do enter, they don't talk about it. One worker in the early 2000s reportedly refused to return. When asked why, he only said, "There's too much silence in there." Even the park rangers fall quiet when the torch is mentioned. Some offer facts, others shrug. But one, an older guide who's since retired, once said softly, "She knows things she'll never tell us." And you wonder as you sit in the dimness of the crown, breath fogging up the glass, why a statue designed to welcome would be so full of locked doors. Maybe it wasn't built for us. Not exactly. Maybe it was built for someone else. Or something else. A message not for the crowds or the speeches, but for a single soul lost in time. Encased in copper. Held above the sea. And maybe the statue's most important chamber, the torch is meant to stay closed. Not because it's dangerous, but because it's sacred. The wind rises outside now. The crown creaks faintly. From this close, you can feel her think. You lower your head and climb back down. You know the words even if you don't know where you first heard them. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. They're etched into the base of the Statue of Liberty, now recited in classrooms, quoted in protests carved into history. But in the beginning, no one wanted them. No one cared. In fact, that poem, the one that changed how the world saw liberty, almost never made it onto the statue at all. It started not with bronze or copper, but paper. In 1883, as Liberty's pedestal fund floundered in America, a group of writers, artists, and thinkers gathered to help. They organized an art auction to raise money, paintings, sculptures, and yes, poetry. Emma Lazarus was invited. She was a poet, yes, but not a household name. Born in New York City, raised in a wealthy Sephardic Jewish family, Emma had already published several volumes of poetry, most unnoticed. Her work leaned philosophical, melancholic, and deeply personal, and she wasn't particularly interested in public monuments. When asked to contribute, she declined at first. What could she possibly say about a statue? But something about liberty stirred her. Not the figure, not the torch, but the idea, the silent promise she might someday represent. Emma had spent years working with Jewish refugees fleeing pogroms in Eastern Europe. She had seen desperation, hunger, people with no shoes stepping off boats into the gray of Manhattan. They didn't want inspiration. They wanted permission to live. So Emma wrote. She wrote not about France or freedom or politics, but about the mother of exiles. A woman who didn't wave flags or wield swords, but one who stood silently, her lamp lifted not in triumph, but in invitation. A mighty woman with a torch whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. She titled it The New Colossus. It wasn't celebrated. The poem was printed in a small pamphlet at the charity auction. It raised no eyebrows. Bartholdi never read it. The committee didn't engrave it on the pedestal. The statue arrived and was dedicated in 1886, with no mention of the poem. Emma died a year later, at 38, tuberculosis, gone before her poem meant anything. For over a decade, it lingered in obscurity. Few people knew it. Even fewer read it. Liberty, meanwhile, was still seen as a symbol of Franco-American friendship, or political unity, or Enlightenment ideals. Not immigration, not welcome. That came later. In the early 1900s, as waves of immigrants flooded Ellis Island, a shift began. The statue looming across the water became more than a monument. It became a memory trigger, the first face many newcomers saw. Newspapers started referring to her as a guardian, a mother, a welcome, and someone remembered Lazarus's poem. In 1903, after pressure from activists and intellectuals, a bronze plaque bearing the text of the New Colossus was affixed to the inner wall of the pedestal. No ceremony, no spotlight, just placed. And still it didn't resonate, not yet. It took years. It wasn't until the 1930s, as fascism rose in Europe and refugees begged for asylum, that her words became scripture. Franklin D. Roosevelt quoted them. Radio programs recited them. Suddenly, liberty wasn't just a gift. She was a promise, and Lazarus a prophet. But history has short memory. In recent decades, the poem's meaning has been debated, twisted, ignored. Some officials have even tried to rewrite its intent, claiming it was meant for Europeans only, or for the deserving, as if the line, "the wretched refuse of your teeming shore," wasn't plain enough. Historians argue, activists shout, but the words remain, and maybe that's the most haunting part, because Emma Lazarus never saw her poem matter. She never knew that her most famous lines would shape the soul of a monument and a nation. She wrote in the quiet, in the space between outrage and faith, in a borrowed apartment, scribbling by candlelight, long after anyone had stopped listening. And yet, you remember them. Right now, in the dark. You hear them in her voice, soft, tired, certain. "Send these, the homeless tempest tossed, to me." I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Not because she was asked, but because she believed someone was out there, still arriving, still huddled, still hoping. The harbor at night is quiet now mostly. You hear the faint churn of a tugboat in the distance. A gull calls once, then disappears into the dark. The city behind you is sleeping or trying to. But out here on the water, under the gaze of liberty's ever-watchful flame, something stirs. Not all stories are symbolic. Some involve real danger. And in 1944, during the height of World War II, danger came to Liberty Island. The story doesn't appear in many textbooks. It rarely surfaces in documentaries. But there are files declassified, yellowed, redacted in places, and they tell of a plan. One made in the shadows. One that nearly turned liberty from a symbol into a ruin. It begins not in America, but in Berlin. The Nazi regime, desperate as the war dragged on, had begun deploying sabotage missions to American shores. These weren't military invasions. They were quieter, covert. Intelligence agents dropped from submarines or smuggled in through ports instructed to sow chaos. Factories, railroads, shipyards, landmarks. The Statue of Liberty, though mostly symbolic, made the list. You sit in a cramped basement office in New York, July 1944. A fan hums. Papers rustle. The air smells of wet wool and cigarette ash. A young FBI agent is reading a report from a port worker who overheard something strange, two men speaking German, whispering about a boat and the green woman. At first, it's dismissed. Too vague. Too dramatic. But within 48 hours, something odd happens. A patrol boat spots a dinghy floating near Liberty Island at 3 to 12 a.m. No lights, no identification. Two figures aboard rowing silently, vanishing into the fog. The Coast Guard arrives, but the boat is gone. Only footprints remain on the island, pressed into the wet shoreline mud, leading toward the southern edge of the statue's base. Security is heightened immediately. The army installs a round-the-clock guard post on the island. Motion sensors are rigged along the shoreline. Liberty's interior is inspected for explosives. None are found, but the files suggest something more chilling. Inside the pedestal museum, a fuse box had been tampered with. Wires twisted, burn marks near a junction panel. An investigation is opened quietly. The FBI conducts interviews. Employees questioned, logbooks rechecked. Nothing conclusive. The official record calls it an attempted infiltration. No suspects caught, no charges filed. But several agents continued to work the case long after tracking similar sabotage incidents in Boston, Baltimore, and Newark. And here's the strange part: according to one handwritten report never published, one of the suspected saboteurs may have been an American citizen born in Queens, raised in Germany, returned under a false passport. He had family near Battery Park. His alias, Carl Voss. The report ends with a single line: no further sightings after August 2nd. What happened to Voss? No one knows. But Liberty slept uneasily that summer. She wasn't alone. Across the country, landmarks were placed under increased surveillance. Hoover himself insisted that America's soul shall not be shaken by cowards in the night. Still, the agents posted to Liberty Island remained, just in case. The statue, ironically, had never felt so vulnerable. And yet, she stood. By day, thousands of tourists smiled and waved. Children posed at her feet. Couples kissed in her shadow. By night, flashlights swept across the base, and armed guards patrolled the galleries. It didn't last forever. The war ended. The files were boxed, stored, then finally declassified decades later. And even now, few know how close the statue came to danger, real explosive danger. You stand near the southern staircase now. A faint groove marks where the footprints once led. It's barely visible, lost to time erosion repairs. But you feel it, the chill of history brushing the edge of myth. Because Lady Liberty has always faced out toward the world. She welcomes. But that also means she's exposed to bombs, to storms, to sabotage. Yet she endures, not because she's armored, but because she's watched over, not just by soldiers or steel, but by memory, by people who refuse to forget what she means and how close she came to becoming rubble in the harbor. So next time you see her lit against the sky, remember this. There was a night long ago when someone tried to extinguish her. They failed, and she's still burning. By the 1980s, Lady Liberty wasn't looking so good. Sure, she still stood tall torch, held high crown radiant in postcards. But beneath the copper and poetry, she was tired, rusted, wounded in places no one had dared to look for too long. For nearly a century, the Statue of Liberty had endured windstorms, bird collisions, war rumors, careless visitors, and the relentless salt breath of New York Harbor. She needed help. Not a paint job, not a repair, a full rebuild. And so, on a grey morning in 1982, inspectors arrived. Not tourists, not admirers, engineers, armed with clipboards, infrared cameras, and a sobering amount of caution tape. Their task? To see if Liberty, the world's most iconic statue, was in fact still structurally sound. They found problems, lots of them. Cracks in her ribs, warped beams in her arm, corroded bolts holding up her inner framework. Worse, they discovered that Eiffel's original puddled iron supports were suffering from severe galvanic corrosion, a kind of slow-motion self-destruction that happened when copper and iron, separated by a thin bit of moisture, began to consume one another, like a heart dissolving in its own chest. But there was a bigger problem. Her right arm, the one holding the torch, wasn't properly attached. That arm, the most iconic part of the statue, was off by several inches from its intended position. It had been secured with force, not precision, during the rushed final assembly in the 1880s. And now, after almost 100 years of stress, gravity, and wind, it was at risk of detaching. She had become dangerous. Tourists had no idea. They climbed the stairs. They looked out from her crown. They smiled. But the truth, Lady Liberty was in critical condition. So they closed her, shut down the crown, blocked off the torch, turned away the ferries, and then they started taking her apart. Scaffolding wrapped around her body like a cocoon. From base to flame, steel beams and walkways crisscrossed her form. Engineers studied every plate. Conservators took paint samples. Welders moved inch by inch, cutting away rusted sections like surgeons removing decay from an ancient organ. The project was massive. The price tag, $87 million. Half paid by France, half by the US. A joint operation just like her birth had been. Inside, the work was even more delicate. Dozens of iron support beams had to be removed and replaced, each one catalogued, measured, photographed. New stainless steel components were designed to mimic Eiffel's originals, but resist corrosion. The entire staircase system was rebuilt. The copper skin was cleaned gently without removing its century-old patina. And the torch, gone. Well, not quite. The original flame, cracked, patched, and dangerously warped from decades of light and weather, was removed and replaced with a new flame, solid copper, covered in 24-karat gold leaf, truer to Bartholdi's vision than the patched-up glass-paneled version that had aged so badly. The old torch was moved to a museum below her feet, still flickering in memory. And through it all, Liberty stood silent. There were no speeches, no press tours, just the hum of machinery, the hiss of torches, The murmur of welders checking schematics in the dark. One worker wrote in his notebook, "It feels like we're fixing something sacred." Another, "She's more fragile than anyone knows." And the strange part, people kept coming. Even when she was wrapped in scaffolding, visitors rode ferries just to glimpse her. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders and said, "Look, that's her." They didn't need the flame. They didn't need the view from the crown. They just needed to see her standing. On July 4th, 1986, after 4 years of surgery, sweat, and silence, Lady Liberty reopened. A massive celebration followed. Tall ships crowded the harbor. Planes streaked overhead. Dignitaries gave speeches. Fireworks cracked like 1,000 echoes of her near death. And beneath all the noise, there she was again, reborn, still holding the torch, still wearing her crown, still whispering that tired, quiet promise. Come, come as you are. And maybe that's what matters most. That a nation decided to fix her. That engineers, poets, welders, historians, janitors, people from all walks came together to save not just a statue, but a feeling, a hope. She had been forgotten almost, neglected, but not abandoned. And in bringing her back, we remembered something about ourselves too. That even the strongest need care. That symbols rust if left alone. That we can choose to rebuild what time tries to tear down. She wasn't made new. She was made whole. Again, you always thought Liberty's face was just symbolic. A generic expression of peace, maybe. Dignity. Classical beauty. Something an artist pulled from memory or marble. But that's not the truth. Her face, the one carved into copper and lifted above the waves, has a story of its own. And it begins with a woman. Her name, not officially known. Not in the records, not in the blueprints, but everyone has a guess. And Bartholdi. He didn't help. When asked, he simply said, "Her face is that of all mothers. Cryptic, maybe noble, maybe evasive. Because you see, Liberty's face doesn't quite match her body. You stand beneath her now, the floodlights casting long shadows across her robe folds. Look closely. The jawline is heavy, the lips full but set with weariness, the eyes not open wide in triumph, but half-lidded, tired. Watching, not triumphant. Survivor. And it's that gaze that has made historians suspicious for more than a century. Because that wasn't the original plan. Early sketches of the statue show a very different face, more Greco-Roman, more stylized. Think Athena meets Venus. But somewhere between sketch and sculpture, something shifted. The lines softened, the angles changed, the nose widened, the cheeks drooped. Not aged, not ugly, just real. So who was she? Some believe it was Bartholdi's mother, Charlotte. She was a towering presence in his life, both literally and emotionally. She raised him after his father died. She pushed him toward art. She posed for his early works. And she, according to some records, sat for him in the studio as he worked on the model for Liberty. Photographs of Charlotte in her 60s show a striking resemblance: broad forehead, downturned eyes, dignified chin. Could he have modeled Liberty after her? Maybe. But here's the uncomfortable twist. Others say Liberty's face isn't modeled after one woman, but after many. And not all of them agreed to it. One theory rarely mentioned in official circles suggests that Bartholdi used death masks. Clay impressions of the faces of deceased women, anonymous, unclaimed, preserved by sculptors for practice or memory. In his notebooks, there are mentions of reference masks taken from women of sorrow and spirit. One entry lists initials and ages: FL 31, HC 28, MH 40. Beautiful brow, deep-set eyes. Who were these women? We don't know. But we do know that Bartholdi often visited the Paris morgue. Back then, it wasn't just a forensic facility, it was a public curiosity. People went to see the unknown dead. To gawk, to wonder, to guess who these faces had once belonged to. Bartholdi, according to letters, found it haunting and inspiring. He may have traced liberty's sadness from corpses. Is that romantic or terrifying? Perhaps both. There's another story, a quieter one. In 1875, Bartholdi met a woman in Egypt, a washerwoman widowed working near the Suez Canal. He was sketching by the water. She brought him tea. They spoke awkwardly. She told him she had once dreamed of crossing the ocean. Her name is lost, but his sketch of her survived, labeled only l'âme simple, the simple soul, the eyes identical. So maybe liberty isn't one woman. Maybe she's all of them. A widow, a refugee, a mother, a stranger whose face was never supposed to be remembered, now cast in copper for centuries. And that would explain something. Because liberty doesn't smile. She doesn't celebrate. She watches, worn and wide and still, as if remembering all the people who once looked back at her, not from postcards or drones or helicopters, but from ships, crammed with fear and salt and hope. Thousands, millions, each one believing she was smiling. But maybe she wasn't. Maybe she was simply there. Maybe that was enough. Because what if liberty isn't an invitation, but a mirror? A reflection not of what we dream, but what we fear to forget. That freedom, real freedom, looks exhausted. It carries weight. It holds steady through the storm. Not because it's perfect, but because it has seen what happens when people are not free. And stood anyway. You turn from her, now standing in the museum where her early sketches are displayed. Look again. Early version, elegant, abstract, untouchable. Later versions more human, more weary, more present. And then there's the final mold, the one Bartholdi kept, found in his attic after his death. Cracked, rough, made of plaster and cloth, and in tiny letters carved into the base. Just this, a toot, to all. Not one woman, all of them. It's impossible, you think. Absurd. How could something so massive, so world-famous, so etched into every schoolchild's mind, just vanish? But it almost did. There was a night not so long ago when Lady Liberty went dark, and the world wondered, where did she go? It was March 1st, 2017. A cold evening, the wind curled low across the harbor. Ferries had stopped for the night. The last visitors had been gone for hours. The sky was clear, cloudless, the stars sharpening against the chill. And suddenly, without warning, the lights around the Statue of Liberty went out. All of them. The pedestal, the floodlights, the torch, the soft glow that usually bathes her face in amber. Gone. In one breath, she disappeared into the night. New Yorkers noticed first. Photos appeared on social media, a pitch-black skyline where she should have been. Journalists called it eerie. One post read simply, "She's gone." Others weren't so subtle, "Lady Liberty has left the building." Then came the theories. A power failure, a technical glitch, or something more. The timing was strange. That very week across the United States, protests had erupted over immigration bans. Airports were filled with chants. Cities lit up in fury. Lawyers slept on courthouse floors. People held signs with Liberty's face. "We are the tired, the poor." And now she'd gone dark. Silent. The coincidence was chilling. Some said it was sabotage. Others swore it was a message from the statue herself or the universe. A silent protest. A mourning. A turning away from a country that had forgotten its promise. But the National Park Service offered an explanation the next morning. Unplanned outage. Routine work on the lighting system. Backup generators failed to engage. Nothing dramatic. Nothing to see here. But no one believed it. Not really. Because something about the way she vanished felt deliberate. You had to be there. The harbor was unusually still. Even the air seemed cautious, as if it, too, was holding its breath. Ferries slowed as they passed her island. Tourists spoke in whispers. Without light, Liberty felt bigger, more ancient, not a statue, a shadow. She wasn't smiling, she wasn't welcoming, she was watching. And that's when you realize Liberty doesn't need light to be seen. She lives in the mind, in memory, in myth. And myths, as you know, are most powerful in the dark. That night, people stood on rooftops and stared at the blackness. And still they felt her. Still they spoke her name. Still they whispered what she stood for. And then the lights came back on. Slowly. First a flicker, then the torch, then the crown. She re-emerged not with fanfare, but like a breath drawn deep after a long silence. And everyone exhaled, because she was still there. But her brief disappearance raised a question few were ready for. What happens if she goes out for good, not physically, not the copper and bolts, but the idea? What happens if we forget what she's supposed to mean? What if the next generation sees her not as a symbol of welcome, but just another old monument worn out, misused, rebranded? What if the torch no longer points forward? Liberty has always been more than art, more than bronze and poetry and tours. She is a story we tell ourselves about who we are, who we were, and who we wish to become. And stories like lights must be tended. You can't just assume they'll stay on forever. You have to protect them, polish them, speak them aloud again and again, especially when the night grows quiet and the world feels uncertain. That night in 2017, it was only 10 minutes of darkness. But for many, it felt longer, and it served as a reminder she's not invincible, not permanent. She can vanish. And if she does, if we let her go dark and say nothing, then we lose more than a statue. We lose what she guarded. We lose what she dared to promise. But for now, she's still there, still standing, still watching. And tonight, just like every night, she's holding her torch again. Lit not with flame, but with memory. And maybe that's the brightest light of all. Now take a long breath. Let the harbor fall away. Let the copper folds of Liberty's robe blur into shadow. The torch fades. The skyline softens. The gentle creak of her crown disappears into the hush of your breath. You are no longer climbing stairs or staring through glass. You are simply floating. Floating on memory. Floating on myth. Because the Statue of Liberty isn't just a landmark. She's a lullaby. A long, slow hum beneath the waves of history. Not perfect, not untouched, but standing even when cracked, even when doubted, even when dark. You've wandered through her bones tonight, climbed her spine, looked through her tired eyes. You've heard the whispers in her pedestal, felt the heat in her forgotten torch. You've stood where spies once tiptoed, where birds once fell, where welders once knelt to patch her broken heart. And now you're here, still, quiet. Let that stillness wrap around you, like scaffolding, like warm steel. Let it cradle your thoughts. Let it carry you towards sleep slow and unafraid. Because Liberty doesn't need you to remember every date or blueprint. She only asks that you not forget how it felt to stand beneath her, knowing she sees you, knowing she sees everyone. And tomorrow, when you wake, she'll still be there, watching, waiting, lit from within by all the stories that refuse to be forgotten. End of script. Thank you for listening to the entire video. Now take a deep breath, relax your body, and start getting some good sleep. Good night from Sleepy Kingdoms. If you like this space and want to see me again on future nights, please like and follow. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. We have many more nights to tell stories together.